Okay, for those of you who are watching online or watching on Facebook, I want to welcome you out today. I'm Pastor Chris with Grace Christian Church. I want to welcome everybody here out. We are going to continue in our series in Matthew. We are still in the Great Betrayal mini-series. And we're getting to a point in Matthew, and this sounds strange because of what we're covering, but we're covering the events, surrounding and including the crucifixion. And I know it sounds strange to hear me say this, but this is one of my favorite sections of Scripture, just because it really lets people get a glimpse of the depth of the love Christ had for us to go through the things that he's going through. And to know that he did that simply because he desires a relationship with us is just amazing to me. So now last week we discussed the final phase of Jesus' trial before Pilate. This was his last trial. And we found out that even though he could have defended himself, he didn't. Pilate even reminded him, and he's like, hey, listen, these are serious charges. I mean, they're charging you with sedition. And realize if I don't find you innocent, you will be put to death, and that death will be crucifixion. But Jesus didn't open his mouth. And the reason was because he fully trusted and accepted God's plan for him. Now, this week, we'll be discussing the last days of Jesus' physical life here on earth. Now, since his last day on earth physically was a Friday, I called this message Black Friday, and this is part one of my, we'll have Black Friday part two. I just thought that Black Friday should actually make some sense, so I titled the message that. But this Friday certainly was a dark day for him, because this was a day when everyone turned on him. This is a day when he suffered like no man has ever suffered. But the big thing I want you to take away is that, the reason he suffered this darkness and this pain and this humiliation was because he wanted us to be able to live in the light. And to live in the light free of charge by faith alone. And we just need to remember that how we live our life reflects how we feel about what he went through for us. And it's very important that we take serious what he did and try our best to honor his name. So anyway, we're going to jump into today's message. If you'll jump with me, Matthew 27, starting in verse 27. It says, "Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand. And they knelt down before him and mocked him, saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews.' They spat on him and took the reed and began to beat him on the head. And after they had mocked him, they took the scarlet robe off him and put his own garments back on him and led him away to crucify him." Okay. So we're picking up here where Pilate has already passed judgment on Jesus, and so he's going to be crucified. So the soldiers lead him to something called the praetorium. Now, what a praetorium was just a well-guarded fortress or a castle is what it was, just a well-guarded fortress or a castle. And a lot of times governors and important people would actually live in the praetorium, because they knew that was their safest place to live. It would be really hard to assassinate a leader here, because, there were barracks there, the soldiers stayed there, so it was just basically a fortress or a castle. Now, Praetorium had these big courtyards, and Roman soldiers would often gather there, like on their day off or when there was a meeting, because there were thousands of soldiers there, and so they'd always gather in that spot, right? So when they took Jesus to this Praetorium, when he walks in to be tortured, there was a cohort of Roman soldiers there. Now, I want you to appreciate what that means. That means 600 soldiers were there. So this humiliation and this torture that he's about to endure was not done in a corner privately where there were no witnesses. The beating that he took, the torture that he endured, took place in front of 600 just soldiers, not including whoever else was in that Praetorium. Okay, so this is a very public event. All right, now the soldiers, they decided they were going to make a mockery of him. So what they did was they put a scarlet robe on him, and then they twisted together a crown of thorns, and they didn't place it gently on his head. They jammed it into his head. Okay, they jammed it into his head. And the reason they did that was kings wore scarlet robes. And both kings and Greek athletes wore crowns of laurels. The athletes were given those as a prize for winning, and kings wore them to show their royalty. Okay, so that was their way of mocking his claim to be king of the Jews. So after they set him up like that and they put a reed in his hand, They knelt before him and said, "Oh, hail, King of the Jews," and laughed and mocked him in front of everyone. Now, see, something you'll find out about the Romans are the Romans literally enjoyed to inflict pain and humiliation on people. They actually enjoyed that, and they were good at it. They knew technique about how to hurt people, right? For instance, they knew that the human head has all kinds of blood vessels in it. I mean, just tons of blood vessels in it. Anybody here ever hit their head? I got to ask you a question. I don't know if this is just me, but am I the only one? When I hit my head, I am instantly furious. Anybody else? You just want to punch something. Right? Anybody do that? And so, you know how when you hit your head and you cut it? I mean, it bleeds, doesn't it? And I think it's kind of funny seeing young parents, and I know this sounds bad, but when they get to be older parents, they'll understand what I'm saying. Young parents, when their kid bumps their head and gets a little cut up and they start bleeding, they're like, "Oh, no, aneurysm, let's take her to the hospital." Once you've had 2 or 3, you're like, it'll be all right. Stick a Band-Aid on it. Head just bleeds a lot. So the head has tons of blood vessels all over it, and they knew that. And when they jammed that into his head, not only was it excruciatingly painful, but it bled, and it bled excessively, right? And so as they're bleeding, as the blood is running down his face, they started to strike him on the head with that reed. Now remember, it says they struck him on the head, where that crown of thorns is. So they are driving those into his scalp. Imagine the blood that was running down his face. And then after they take the robe off of him and put him back in his normal clothes, they start to beat him even more, and then they start spitting on him. Okay, imagine how bad this would be. I mean, how painful this would be, how humiliating this would be. And the whole time, it shocks me that no one even considered, not even one of them considered, what if he really is who he says he was? None of them even considered that as they kept beating him and mocking him and spitting on him. Oh, they're going to realize who he was someday when they stand before him. But at this point, they didn't even consider that, right? I mean, you're going to find out here in the scripture I'm about to read, the Bible actually tells us that he was beaten so badly, because sometimes I think it's hard to appreciate when we think of a beating, we think of somebody leaving with a black eye and a busted lip, right? But the Bible tells us he was actually beaten until he was unrecognizable. Okay, you could not recognize who he was. It even tells us that it was hard to see that he was human. That's how bad he was beaten. And ironically, I mean, these Roman soldiers in the middle of their mockery and their torture didn't realize, unknowingly, they're fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy with what they're doing. Look at this, Isaiah 52:14. It says, "But many were amazed when they saw him. His face was so disfigured, he seemed hardly" what? Human. Now, have you ever seen someone beat that bad? Now, I've been in the hospital with people who've been in severe car accidents, and I know what it looks like to have someone's face severely damaged, but you could always see who they were. You could barely tell he was human. And it says, "And from his appearance, one would scarcely know he was" what? A man. This is how bad they beat him before he even left to be crucified, right? Think about that for a second. Now, let me give you a little background why the Romans were like that. A lot of it was culture, but the Romans felt that Jesus and Jews in general were beneath them. Actually, the Romans pretty much thought anyone that wasn't Roman was beneath them. They look at them as second-class citizens, almost subhuman. So when they would torture and beat and humiliate somebody, they felt very little, if any, remorse. It didn't even bother them, because they felt that superior to everyone else, right? And so that attitude led them to beat him to be unrecognizable, even to barely look human, right? But there's something here I want to spend a little bit of time on, okay? Because I don't think they understood another thing they were doing. See, people often look at the fact that the thorns were on his head, and they go, "Yeah, that's terrible," and they move right past it. But what I don't think we realize is those thorns were actually very symbolic. Okay, let me explain that to you. See, the thorns symbolize the sin of all mankind. Did you know that? And Genesis chapter 3 explains that. Follow me here. Genesis chapter 3, starting in verse 17. It says, "Then to Adam he said, 'Because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat from it, cursed is the ground because of you. Now listen, in toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. Right? Listen, when I used to detassel corn when I was a teenager, and that is a bad job. I mean, it's a bad job. I've done a lot of jobs in my life, and that is the crowning jewel worst one. And I remember thinking, as I look back on that, that's Adam's fault, Right? Okay, now, it says, now listen, here's where we get the connection. But what? Thorns and thistles it shall grow for you. Why are the thorns and the thistles growing? Because the ground is cursed. Why is the ground cursed? Because of Adam, right? Because of Adam and Eve's sin. Notice I said, and Eve. If you go back to verse 19, then he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife. We'll leave that there. Anyway, by the sweat of your face, let me start back here, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Okay, so these thorns, think about this. These thorns were a reminder to Adam that the sin that he and Eve committed changed everything. Everything changed the moment mankind sinned against God. Okay, and I think this is really important. Every time Adam saw a thorn, it was supposed to remind him that he messed everything up with his sin. Right? And here's what happens, right? Because the moment they sinned against God, that's when death and suffering and sorrow entered this world. And the reason that's so important is I have so many people come up to me and say, after they've suffered the loss of a loved one, why did God bring death? Why did he take my loved one? Why did God, listen, let me explain something to you. God did not bring death to the party. God didn't bring death. God wasn't the author of death. We are the author of death. When the moment mankind sinned, and a lot of people ask me, well, this isn't fair. I wasn't there. I didn't get the opportunity to turn down the fruit. Listen, if you would have been there, you would have done it too. And before you get all self-righteous, think for just a second how many temptations you give into every day. Think about that. Because any one of those temptations would have made you step out into sin. Any one of them. See, man wasn't created perfect. That is the biggest farce out there. Man was created good. And they were good until they sinned. They were never perfect. They were going to sin, and you would have sinned if you were there, okay? So the moment we sin is when we brought death into this world. God didn't bring death into this world. We are about to study what God did. He brought the solution to death into this world through his son, Jesus Christ. That's how this works, right? So the sin of Adam and Eve brought the suffering and the death into the world. Romans 5:18, Paul says this so good, so amazingly. Romans 5:18, it says, yes, Adam's one sin brings condemnation for who? For everyone. But Christ's one act of righteousness brings a right relationship with God and a new life for everyone. Because one person disobeyed God, many became sinners. Okay? But because one other person obeyed God, many will be made righteous. Isn't that the best description of what happened? He's saying Adam was the representation of all mankind. Man brought death and condemnation. God, through Jesus Christ, brings the opportunity to have righteousness by faith alone in Christ alone. I think that is so powerful. So this crown of thorns that they placed on his head unknowingly represented the fact that Jesus was going to carry the sin of the world to the cross, because those thorns are a reminder of Adam's sin. So the reminder of Adam's sin went with him to that cross. Isn't that perfect? And each drop of blood that fell as those thorns pierced his head represented the blood that was about to pay for the sin. Remember, the sin caused the blood, and that's accurate. Because of our sin, we need the blood of Christ to make us whole. And I think about it, and I think of each drop of blood almost like, can you imagine as each drop runs down his face, that could be the drop that covers the sin you struggle with. Do you know that? They're all covered, every one of them. One drop might have been for addiction. One drop might have been for the liar, for the adulterer. Every drop was paying for every sin that would ever be committed in full. And I just think that's amazing. They didn't realize the symbolism that they had here. What they were doing was playing right into the symbolism and showing the power of God, right? But the cruelty and the mockery that we see here, when most civilized people see this, it's unimaginable. Can you imagine doing this to somebody? If you can, leave. You scare me. Think about it. I mean, you get mad at your boss, but you don't think, I'd like to tie him down and beat him and shove stuff in his scalp and hang him and draw. Nobody thinks like that, right? So this is unimaginable, and we read about this and we think, what person would mock anybody like that? We might think that, but I want you to think for just a second. Really think about it. We still mock him today. Did you know that? Sure, I mean, we're not, intentionally or maliciously mocking him. I hope not anyway. But we do mock him. Now, if you're not a believer, every time you refuse to accept that free gift of grace, you're saying, I don't want it. It's not good for me. It's not good enough for me. I'm better without it. And you don't even realize that every time you reject that, you are saying that what he did on the cross and his defeating death and coming out of that grave isn't good enough for you, and you mock all of it. You're saying, forget it. We don't realize that. But what's even worse, to me, is how believers mock him. And I'll be honest, I think believers mock him worse because unbelievers don't know any better, right? But believers, we know better. Believers, every time we choose to live a life that doesn't reflect his light, we mock him. He gives us one purpose after he gives us eternal life, and that purpose is to let our light shine before men so that they will desire to have a relationship with him. And every time we choose our own will over his, every time we refuse to do what he's asked us to do, we refuse to live lives that honor him, we mock him. We say, listen, I will take your gift of salvation. I don't want to take the responsibility of what you've given your believers to do afterwards. Thanks for the salvation. See you in heaven. That's kind of a mockery, isn't it? We mock him every day, and I don't think we understand that. So what's even worse is, and this is the thing that kills me, what's even worse than believers mocking him is the fact that when you mock God, when you don't live a life that glorifies God, you know what it does? It causes other people who see you and know what you claim to be, it causes them to mock him. And I don't know if this has ever happened to any of you. I'm assuming it has if you've been saved longer than a day. But have you ever had somebody come up to you and say, yeah, does so-and-so go to your church? I am always so scared to answer that. I want to say, yes, I love that guy. But I've learned. Sometimes they come up and say, does so-and-so go to your church? Yeah. Yeah, I saw him in a big bar fight last night, man. He was drunk as a dog, calling off oaths like you wouldn't believe. I guess Jesus changed him, didn't he? Because he refused to live it, not only was he mocking God, he caused someone else to mock God. Or so-and-so going to your church? Yeah, she's cheating on her husband. Did you know that? You know what I always respond to them when they say stuff like that to me? I say, well, I guess they need to be in church, then, don't they? I mean, what do they want me to say? Get the torches and the pitchforks. I mean, what do they want me to say? I'm like, well, I think they need church then. But we don't realize that every time we do that, we don't just mock him, we cause other people to mock him. That's scary. Jesus talked about this when he talked about the salt and light discourse. Let's look at this, Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 13. Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works. Listen, that they may see your works, the things you do, the things you say, and glorify who? Your Father who's in heaven. Right? This is what we're supposed to be doing. Living lives that reflect the love of Christ in us to other people. And people that do that are honoring him. People who do not are mocking him. And the reason I threw that in there is because a lot of times people are so harsh about how the Romans mocked him, and I'm like, what about you? What about you? Let's move on. Matthew 27, starting in verse 32. It says, as they were coming out, they found a man of Cyrene named Simon, whom they pressed into service to bear his cross, Jesus' cross. Okay, so here's another thing the Romans commonly did. Let's be honest, from what you've heard so far, they're some pretty cruel people, are they not? So they beat Jesus to the point where you can't tell he's human. You can't recognize him. And to make matters worse, they had this custom that the person who was found guilty and the penalty was crucifixion, after they would torture them, they would have them carry their own beams. Now, I know a lot of people say it's a cross, but they put the cross together right before they crucified him, so actually they were carrying the beams. And when they got up there, they would make it into a cross. So here this man is barely probably able to stand. And they say, now carry your beam. And he tries. He's trying to carry this. What he went through probably would have killed most people, but he was going to endure because he had a job to do. So he starts trying to carry this cross, this beam that was going to be a cross. And they did that so that they could more humiliate the person who was guilty, the offender, so that everyone would see, you don't want to commit a crime against Rome. Here's what happens to you. Look at the bloody man carrying his own cross to his grave. It's kind of the same thing like in the Nazi Germany when they would make soldiers dig their own graves before they killed them. It's kind of the same theory, right? So here he is carrying this cross, right? It's supposed to add to his public humiliation, add to his suffering, but he was beaten so badly. Remember, he's human, that he could not carry it. Think of the blood loss. Think of how weak he was, and he collapses under the weight. So they forced this man named Simon from Cyrene to carry his beam. Okay, now let me explain to you how that works. See, Roman soldiers had some rights by law that might seem a little strange to you. One of those rights were they had the right at any time to compel any normal citizen to carry any load they wanted for them. And if you didn't, you broke the law. So they could come up and say, hey, carry that. And you had no choice. You had to carry it. You had no choice. That was the law. Now, somehow they had a deal with the children of Israel. And that deal was that they would carry it if the Roman soldiers asked them, but only 1 mile. I don't think that's that sweetheart of a deal, do you? You see the guy that negotiated that? Hey, I got us a good deal. Now we only have to carry heavy stuff for 1 mile. He'd be like, yeah, that's your last deal you negotiate. Get back here. Right? So, but they only had to do 1 mile. Now, the Jews, you know how legalistic they are and how vindictive they are. So when they found that out, here's what they did. They would go and count their steps until they got to 1 mile. So they knew exactly how many steps it took before they were at 1 mile. They need to get a job if they got that much time. I'd never finish that count because I'd probably die of a heart attack at about 3/4 of a mile. But anyway, they counted every step all the way to 1 mile. And they did that. Listen to how vindictive, how petty. So that if a Roman soldier said, you're going to carry this, they'd say, okay, and they'd start counting each step. And when they got to 1 mile, they'd stop and drop it. And they'd look at him and say, that's 1 mile. That's all I'm supposed to do. So as you can imagine, the Roman soldiers did not like them very much. They thought they were lazy, belligerent. They thought they were always nitpicking, trying to start trouble. They just didn't like them. They didn't like them at all, right? And so that's why Jesus said back, in the Sermon on the Mount, remember when he said if they force you to go 1 mile? Remember this? Let's take a look at this. Matthew 5:41 says, whoever forces you to go 1 mile, think about it. Who could force you to go 1 mile? A Roman soldier, right? They're the ones that could force you. It says, whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him what? Go with him too. Now, when you hear that, you think, that is not what I would do. Why would I do that? Right? Now think about this for a second. Jesus wanted Christians to be different. He didn't want them to be petty. He didn't want them to be picking fights. He didn't want them to be getting in stupid arguments. He said, you know what? For once, let's show them what happens when someone's heart has been transformed by the grace of God. Let's show them what happens when joy has replaced all the pain and bitterness and blackness in a person's heart. Let's show them. And when they come at you and say, go with me 1 mile, tell them, listen, can I finish taking this to the destination? I'll go with you too. And those people are going, what? Because that's not normal. Normal people wouldn't do that. Only someone whose heart has been changed would do something like that. That's why Jesus said that. He wanted Christians to be different. He wanted us to be motivated by love and grace, not revenge and anger and pettiness and legalism. That's why he said, if they force you, that's your authority. The Romans were their authorities. He said, if they force you to go to a mile, show them you're different and go too. Don't be petty and count your steps, right? That's what he was telling them. Now, let's go back to Simon. Poor Simon. I feel bad for him because, he only came to Jerusalem to worship during the Passover. That's what he came to Jerusalem for. He's probably getting ready for 9 a.m. service and rushing out the door, and he's trying to get to synagogue by the time service starts, right? He had no idea that he was going to get tied up in a crucifixion. That wasn't his idea. That's not what he wanted to do. He was from Cyrene. Okay, he'd come there specially to worship. Now, Cyrene is a city in northern Africa that had a large number of Jews, a large concentration of Jews that lived there. And the one thing it tells us, him being from Cyrene, they said Simon from Cyrene, you're thinking, why'd they tell us that? Well, it tells us he was a very devout Jew because the city of Cyrene was 1,000 miles from Jerusalem. And he didn't take an Uber. Okay, he didn't take a plane. I imagine this was probably a 3-6 month trip. I don't know. I never traveled like that, nor do I ever want to. We'll just guess 3 to 6 months because he was so set on worshiping his God in Jerusalem at the Passover. So he came 1,000 miles not to watch Jesus be crucified, not to be involved with the crucifixion, to take part in the Passover, right? But little did he know that he was going to have an encounter that would forever link his name with the name of Jesus Christ. He didn't know that, right? But that's exactly what happened. Now, here's a question a lot of people ask me, and I used to wonder this too. Did you ever wonder, out of that huge crowd of people, why did they pick Simon? Why Simon? I imagine he asked that when they first picked him. What, me? Why? Right? Why did they pick Simon? If Simon had been 2 minutes earlier or 2 minutes later, it might have been somebody else. Why did they pick him? It's almost like Simon was designated by God to be there at that time. It's almost like that, isn't it? Let me ask you a question. Do you really think that God wanted just anyone carrying Jesus' beam up that hill? I believe God wanted a devout Jewish man that may understand what he was taking part in. And there's no more devout than traveling 1,000 miles to take part in the Passover. I think that's about as devout as it gets. But I'm sure you're thinking, why Simon? What makes him different? You're in Jerusalem. There had to be a few devout Jews around other than him. Why him? And here's what's interesting is a lot of the historical writers from that time frame recorded something, right? And it's really important that you hear this. They record that this man Simon, when he saw Jesus collapse, had compassion. Some record that he said, someone help him, he can't carry it. Others record that he said that and went up and helped Jesus back to his feet. I believe he did both. And the Romans were in a hurry to get this done, and you know what they said? Hey, you, Mr. Helpy Helperton, now you can carry it. That's how they picked him out. He was compassionate. They go, oh, you want to help him? You want to help the criminal? Now you carry it. That's how he was selected, right? And that's just amazing. So think about this for a second. He could have refused this. Now, a lot of people, when I say that, they say he couldn't have refused it. A Roman officer told him. Remember what the environment's like at that time. The governor just released an innocent man to be killed because he was afraid they were about to riot. The Jews were very volatile at that moment, right? And he didn't want to be the governor that had unrest. And he probably told his soldiers, hey, go easy right now. These people are a hot mess. So if he would have said, I'm not carrying it, I'm here from 1,000 miles away, I'm going to go worship like I'm supposed to, he probably would have picked somebody else because it would have been a bad idea to attack another Jew. But he didn't refuse. He didn't refuse. Instead, he just submitted to their authority and helped this poor man who was struggling. So if there's one thing you can learn from Simon, it's that you should always be ready to serve because you never know when God is going to put you in a position where you have to serve. See, he probably didn't know who Jesus was personally. I'm sure he probably heard about him, but he wasn't a follower. Yet his compassion and willingness to serve his fellow man reminds you a lot of Jesus. You see what I mean? This is a man whose heart was for the Lord. You see why God wanted him there? He had compassion on him, right? You never know when God is going to set you up in a situation just like that. And sometimes the situation he puts you in is going to require humility. Now, we're all ready for the fight, but are you ready to show the love and power of Christ through humility? Because that's what we have here, right? Imagine there's a fight brewing, and instead of trying to pick your side and get ready for battle, the person who says, listen, I don't want anything to do with that. We don't have to do this. The person who brings peace to a volatile situation, the person who shows the love of Christ when everyone else is angry. You know, sometimes that's the greatest warrior God has, is the one that can serve in humility like this. Now, there are times when he will put you in a situation where you need to be bold, even when it's not popular to be. I shared this with the early service. When we first became a church, we grew from our reception hall, and we moved into a storefront. And they gave me a 2-year exemption. I didn't understand that at the time. They said every 2 years you got to come back and ask permission to be able to operate on Main Street. It bugged me. I consulted an attorney, and I started studying the ordinances, and I found out something. Nobody else had that. Nobody. Just us. Everybody else had blanket exemption to be on Main Street. So I go to this meeting alone. So, I mean, you imagine how that felt. And they call you up to the podium, and you feel like a kid at a spelling bee. It's terrible. And you walk up there, and they said, what can we do for you? And I said, I want a blanket exemption like everybody else. And they said, well, we think we should keep you at 2 years. I said, why? And they said, well, because we heard that you said that all were welcome at your facility. I said, well, we're a church. They said, we're afraid of what kind of element you might bring to Main Street. I go, you have 2 dive bars on this street. Bringing the element in and getting them tanked. And you're worried about a church. We want that element to come in so we can let Jesus change their life. You know? And so I told him, I said, I did a little searching here. I'm zoned just like everybody else is. So either they all go on 2-year exemptions, you give me a blanket exemption, or I need to talk to an attorney. And they said, blanket exemption. Now you think, oh, how brave. No, I was terrified. I was terrified. I would have easily passed that off on a little girl if she would have taken it. I was terrified. It's just funny that in the moment, God will give you what you need if you're willing to serve and submit to the authority and do what he asks you to do. It's amazing how he did that, all right? So if you want to learn from Simon, always be ready to serve in any capacity he wants you to, yet through compassion, okay? Now let's keep moving on. Matthew 27:33. It says, and when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull, they gave him wine to drink mixed with gall, and after tasting it, he was unwilling to drink. Now, the place they took Jesus was called Golgotha. In the Latin, that means, not in the Latin, that just means place of the skull. And it's kind of funny because when people hear about this, they think, place of the skull. That's probably because there was a graveyard there. I've heard that a million times. Or maybe it's because they executed people there. No, here's why it was called the place of the skull. You ready for this? Because it looked like a skull. It was a hill. Have you ever looked in the clouds and go, wow, that looks like a vacuum cleaner? You ever do that? When you were walking up to this hill from a long way away, and you go, that looks like a skull. That's literally how it got its name. I wish I had a cool story for you, but that's it. Somebody just said, looks like a skull. Golgotha. That's how it got its name. Sorry, I should have made something cool up, but that's what it was. Okay, so they take him to this place, and the path that Jesus took in the Latin is called the Via Dolorosa. Anybody ever hear that? The Via Dolorosa. And what that means in Latin is way of grief or way of sorrow. Some say way of tears. That's what that means. Now, the strange thing is people go to Jerusalem just to walk the Via Dolorosa so they can walk the same path Jesus did from the Praetorium to the cross. The problem is no one really knows what roads they took. No one really knows. But they call that the trail of tears or the way of grief or way of sorrow. And I was thinking about that, and I thought, isn't that strange how what they call the way of grief or the way of sorrow or the trail of tears became the path to our redemption and freedom? I don't think it's a way of grief. I think that was if anything, that was a trail of love. because he took that willingly to give us eternal life. Don't you think? I think it's crazy that we focus on the negative there when he was going there for the positive, right? Because of his suffering, because he was willing to take that walk, we have eternal life. Okay, I think that is so, so powerful. Right, now listen, they offered Jesus wine, and everybody always tries to spiritualize and do all this weird stuff with it, and here's what it was. Yes, it was fermented. When people tell you, oh, wine in the Bible means grape juice. No, it does not. The Greek word means fermented wine. Okay, it's not grape juice, so give me a break, right? What this was they would take wine mixed with, it was a vinegar type of wine, a vinegar-based wine. So you can imagine how yummy that was, right? And then they mixed it with gall. And what they'd use that for was it became a really powerful anesthetic. It would literally, ease pain. It was a really strong painkiller, right? And so when they let him taste it, he said, no, I can't take that. I'll tell you why here in just a minute. But here's what gets to me. They would give that to people to ease the pain of the crucifixion. Does anybody think that's a really feeble attempt at doing something nice after everything they've already done? We're humane. We give them a little bit of a painkiller before we brutally murder them. They're trying to act like they're being compassionate. Hey, if you want to be compassionate, how about give him a fair trial? How about not beat him half to death before you murder him? That would have been the time for compassion. Don't give me a Tylenol now. It just cracks me up that was considered, them being compassionate, right? But they didn't realize that this, again, they were fulfilling prophecy left and right and didn't even know it. So they fulfilled another prophecy here. Psalm 69, verse 21 says, they also gave me gall for my food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink, or vinegar wine. All right, so think about this for a second. Jesus refused it. And people always ask me, why would he refuse that? I wouldn't have, would you? That's why I said I could never have a baby. I'd say, give me 3 epidurals. Right, one here, one here. He refused it. He knew what it was when he tasted it, and he said no. You know why? He refused that because he wanted to experience every last bit of that crucifixion. Because had he taken that pain medicine, you know what people would have said? Oh, it really wasn't that big a deal. I mean, they gave him pain medicine. He probably didn't feel anything. It wasn't that big of a sacrifice. I mean, what could he do? He had to have a clear mind. He had to experience all of it. Listen, I've had people come up to me and literally say, yeah, I know he was crucified, but he's the Son of God. So don't you think that maybe God took the pain away from it for him? No, I don't. He suffered and suffered greatly. He was crying out to God, and we'll talk about that next week. He was in pain. I mean, beyond all recognition, this man was in pain. And the other thing is even on the cross, as we will see next week as I'm winding down here, even on the cross, he was thinking about the work he had yet to do. See, he couldn't die before he had a couple more things he had to do, even when he was on the cross. He had to keep a clear head. So in the worst, most painful, dark time in his life, he's still lovingly thinking of other people. Think about that for a second. That is so powerful. Now, next week, we're going to see, next week's very, very powerful. There's so many things we're going to cover in the actual crucifixion. So many things. So do not miss and bring a couple friends, because if you want to appreciate how much he loved you, listen to what he does when he comes to this cross. Now, I'm going to close here, but we're about to have communion. And let me explain that to you. Communion is the celebration that has been pulled from the Passover. And we are celebrating the blood of Christ that was shed on that cross and the body that he gave as a sacrifice for many. Now listen, we don't want you to be real solemn about it, because they used to celebrate it, they were excited. It was a celebration. They talked to their friends and they thought about it. So we're going to ask whoever's a believer that wants to take part in this, just line up on each side, and you can come up and take your bread, which represents the body, and dip it in the juice, which represents his blood. And we want you to think of the great sacrifice he made, but we don't want you to think that this has to be solemn. We are overjoyed that he was willing to make that sacrifice for us. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to the praise team.